Alrighty, we're going to go ahead and jump in. Um, on behalf of all of us at the Center for Public Health Law Research, I just want to welcome you to our legal epidemiology at lunch, structural racism and racial equity legal data. We're so excited to have you here. My name is Jane. I am a program manager here at the center, and we have a great panel today of presenters. I'm going to take a moment to introduce each and one of them, give you a brief background. I just want to remind everyone too that we will have some time for Q&A at the end. So we will address all questions at that time, but feel free to chat any questions either in the Q&A option or in the chat feature. So first, I'd like to introduce DeAnna Baumle. She's a senior law and policy analyst at the Center for Public Health Law Research, and her work centers on intersecting issues of health and equity, including research focused on reproductive justice, racial equity, queer and trans rights, and economic justice. Our next presenter will be Cydney Murray, and she is a law and policy analyst at the Center for Public Health Law Research as well. In that role, she researches and creates legal epidemiology datasets across various public health topics with a focus on abortion law, racial health equity, and reproductive justice. Next, I'm excited to introduce Phyllis Jaden as a senior attorney with the Network for Public Health Law Mid-States Region Office, where she focuses on health equity and public health authority work. Phyllis also has experience in the areas of public benefits, housing, consumer protection, employment, and in protection from abuse. Prior to joining the network, Phyllis spent several years on social justice and equity work while employed with other legal nonprofits, including the largest provider of free legal services in Michigan. And next, we have Medina Agenor. Medina is an interdisciplinary scholar with a background in social epidemiology and women's and gender studies, and associate professor in the Department of Behavioral and Social Sciences at Brown University School of Public Health. Dr. Agenor's research focuses on the structural and social determinants of health inequities, with particular interests in racism, gender, sexuality, bodily autonomy, healthcare, and policy. Her most recent research pertains to how discrimination in healthcare and the law, including racism, sexism, heterosexism, and cisgenderism, shapes the health and healthcare experiences of marginalized people, especially Black and LGBTQ+ people. And finally, I would like to introduce Arriola Carnicelli, who is a research assistant at Brown University's Department of Behavioral and Social Sciences, and also works as a program assistant at local initiatives support cooperation in Rhode Island in the health equity zone arena. So that's our list of panelists and presenters for today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to DeAnna to kick us off.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that introduction, Jane. Today, my colleague Cydney and I will be discussing one of the center's ongoing projects, a legal data set examining U.S. state constitutions' treatment of race, both explicit and implicit, and governance. Next slide, please. In recent years, there has been growing recognition among public health researchers and practitioners of how racism, sexism, and other structural forces of oppression impact health and well-being and result in continuing inequities. Here, we have a slightly modified version of Rakaya Yerbi's revised Social Determinants of Health framework, which illustrates how structural racism and other structural oppressions are the root cause of such inequities. Law is the tool through which these oppressions and hierarchies are maintained. Laws are typically created and enforced by actors who benefit from white male supremacy, and they create and reinforce discrimination in both explicit and implicit ways. These laws, in turn, directly impact the systems that determine our lived environments, our neighborhoods, our healthcare, our education, and our ability or lack of ability to achieve economic stability. And this results in inequitable health and well-being. Essentially, whenever studying law and its impact on health, we must recognize that racism and other oppressions are not just a factor in that inequity, but a cause. Next slide, please. So law is vast and complicated in this nation, and there are so many ways it could be studied. For our project, we chose to focus on state constitutions, which are sometimes overlooked in these conversations, but they are at least as important and impactful as the federal constitution. They establish each state's government, grant and limit power to people, institutions, and state and local government branches, and enumerate individual rights that often extend beyond federal protections. And as you can see here, those constitutions sometimes very explicitly entrench racism and other structural oppressions within the very foundation of that state's law. Historically, state constitutions explicitly granted certain rights only to white men, usually property-owning men, and explicitly excluded groups from certain enumerated rights and from voting or holding state office. Some of this explicit language has only recently been removed, or even still remains in those constitutions. For example, the 1901 Alabama Constitution, yes, the one created by the convention led by this guy on the slide, remained the state's constitution until 2023. Additionally, provisions that on their face are racially neutral, or even provisions that appear to safeguard against racial discrimination, can be intended to and result in discrimination and exclusion. Further, unlike the federal constitution, state constitutions are much easier to amend. Some have been amended hundreds of times over the last couple centuries. Arguably, as a result, these constitutions are more democratic, but they're also more majoritarian than the federal constitution or even other state-level laws. Every state but one contains an explicit commitment to people power in that vein, but who are the people? Next slide, please. To dig into these issues, the center has partnered with an incredible team from Ohio State University to evaluate the impact of state constitutions on health inequities, recognizing them as a powerful tool of structural racism and oppression. Using policy surveillance methods, our team at the center is creating a longitudinal legal data set for all 50 states, capturing changes in particular provisions of state constitutions over a 20-year period. Once our data set is complete, the OSU team will evaluate how those variables impact systems and lived environments, and in turn result in inequitable health outcomes. Now I'll turn it over to Cydney, who will go into some more detail about what specific provisions we are capturing in our legal data set.
Thanks, DeAnna. Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us today. As DeAnna mentioned, I will be talking through a few legal variables we are measuring in the state constitution's race and governance data set, as well as some preliminary findings. For this presentation, we have grouped select variables into 3 general buckets: the power of the people, race, and voting. In examining state constitutions for the political power they may or may not afford the people, 3 questions our data set asks are: does the state constitution explicitly declare that political and government power is inherent to the people? Does the state constitution explicitly allow the people to abolish the government? And does the state constitution explicitly allow the people to directly amend its text? From a sample batch of 10 state constitutions, we have found that as of December 31st, 2023, 9 state constitutions explicitly declare that political and government power is inherent to the people, and only 5 state constitutions explicitly allow the people to abolish their state governments. 6 of the sample state constitutions explicitly allow the people to directly amend their text via citizen-initiated ballot initiatives. As we saw during last week's election, ballot initiatives are important tools for the people of a state to voice their desires and demands for their own governance. Citizen-initiated ballot initiatives are particularly useful as they provide a nearly direct line between the will of the people and their government. Next slide, please. Our data set not only captures explicit mention of race by state constitutions, but it also seeks to capture legal variables that clearly implicate race. A few questions our data set asks include: does the state constitution explicitly reference race in its text? Does the state constitution explicitly prohibit discrimination on the basis of race? Does the state constitution prohibit slavery? Does the state constitution explicitly reference the federal constitution's Reconstruction amendments? And does the state constitution declare English to be the state's official language? Some notable findings from that same sample batch of 10 state constitutions include that as of December 31st, 2023, 8 of those state constitutions explicitly prohibit discrimination on the basis of race, with Oregon and Ohio being the 2 outliers. We also found that 4 state constitutions, Florida, Missouri, Pennsylvania, and Texas, do not mention slavery and therefore do not prohibit slavery, unlike the other 6 sample state constitutions. Lastly, preliminary findings show that not only do Florida's and California's constitutions declare English to be the official language of the state, but California's constitution further requires state officials to ensure that the role of English as the common language is preserved and enhanced, and it prohibits the California legislature from enacting any laws that diminish or ignore the role of English as the common language of the state. Next slide, please. Our final bucket of legal variables to discuss during our portion of the presentation is voting. We structured this data set's voting questions to both ask whether a state's constitution explicitly prohibits certain people from voting and whether a state's constitution explicitly allows the state legislature to prohibit certain people from voting. From the same sample batch, we found that 6 state constitutions explicitly prohibit certain people from voting, and 5 allow the state legislature to enact prohibitions. We included on this slide a running list of potential response options based on prohibitions we have already encountered in state constitutions studied thus far. As we are still in the initial stages of this project, it is possible that the categories of people who are or may be excluded from voting will grow. Lastly, only 2 of the sample state constitutions, Oregon and Ohio, explicitly prohibit poll taxes. Next slide, please. As this project is still ongoing, we kindly ask that you stay tuned for the future publication of this data set. Thank you very much for your time, and please don't hesitate to reach out to DeAnna or myself with any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, both Cydney and DeAnna. Phyllis, you are up next.
Thank you, Jane. If you could go ahead and move to the next slide. Hi, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. Again, my name is Phyllis Jaden. I'm a senior attorney with the Network for Public Health Law, and I am really excited to talk to you about our 21-22 racial equity data set. This was released late in the summer, so it's relatively new. And we are excited to just give you a bit of an introduction. So I'll start with letting you know that this project was not initially designed for the data gathered to then be coded using Monocle and to be a public facing on Law Atlas. The project was actually initially designed by the former director of the health equity team at the Network for Public Health Law, that's Don Hunter. So I was working with the health equity team at the time this project started, and Don was interested in taking a dive into the legislative outcome of what we began referring to as the renewed racial justice movement of 2020. We wanted to see what laws were popping up that seemed related to that movement in the 21 and the 22 legislative cycles. So we, and I say we, but really our law clerk, Haley Campbell Garcia, did a fantastic job of scanning bills that were introduced during those sessions across the 50 states. She scanned those laws for specific keyword searches. And those keyword searches were racial equity, racism, intergenerational, implicit bias, health equity, health disparities, and racial disparities. So after this scan was done, we ended up with quite a bit of information, really too much information to be usable. So we took, I think it was about 400 or so bills. We cut those bills down into the laws that were enacted, And then we connected those laws to the different buckets of the social determinants of health. I'm sure most attendees are familiar with the social determinants of health, but of course, it's always nice to ground any discussion with definitions. So Healthy People 2030 defines the social determinants of health as the conditions in the environments where people are born, live, work, play, worship, and age that affect a wide range of health functioning and quality of life outcomes and risks. And so the categories in the data set for the social determinants of health are, of course, healthcare access and quality, education access and quality, neighborhood and built environment, social and community context, and economic stability. So once we gathered all this data, cut it down, categorized it according to these areas of the social determinants of health, we found it still wasn't extremely accessible or usable. And that's when we thought to use Monocle and Law Atlas in order to showcase this data in a way that would make it more accessible and usable for folks who are working in the area specifically of racial health equity. So Haley and I, we were new to legal epidemiology, new to using Monocle and Law Atlas prior to this project. We spent many hours that ended up frustrating at times, trying to retrofit this data that wasn't intended to be used this way for Law Atlas. Once we neared the end of this project, though, we did start to see that this did come out really well, and we really hope that you will find it something useful for your work, this sort of snapshot in time. And I will point out that part of why this data set is so unique is because it is this snapshot in time that it captures. This aftermath of this renewed racial justice movement of 2020, we wanted to capture what legal trends began on the heels of this. So that is part of what makes this data set unique. We found a lot of interesting things in doing this work. A lot of thoughtful discussions were prompted throughout the course of the project. One of those discussions revolved around whether this data set should focus on sort of health equity generally or racial health equity specifically. After these discussions, we did ultimately decide that the vast majority of laws coded were related specifically to racial health equity. It was only a handful of laws that weren't. And we thought if we included those laws and made it more general, it was going to water down our data. And so folks who focus on the area of racial health equity may otherwise bypass this data set as not as specific and useful to their work. So we did end up deciding to focus just on those laws that relate specifically to racial health equity. So with that, if we can move to the next slide, I'll give you a short introduction to our data set. So like other Law Atlas data sets, the data is set up in a way that answers questions. You can see that yellow oval has our parent question. That was a law enacted in 21 or 22 that relates to racial health equity that was still in effect on December 31st, 2022. So we have very specific parameters for the laws that were included in this data set. So the laws that were coded as yes are going to relate to those keyword searches that we mentioned earlier. It's reasonable that we may not have captured everything that could be relevant to this data set, but we only captured those laws that were going to have those keyword searches we started with. So you could see that all the states that had legislation responsive to that data set, they're marked in purple in the top left corner because I picked the purple button under yes to show that answer. We can go to the next slide, please. On this next slide, we have those child questions that flow from that first affirmative question into those buckets of the social determinants of health that we discussed. And it could be more than one bucket based on the law. Of course, many laws will touch on different areas of the social determinants of health. For the example on the screen, that first social determinant of health is, does that law relate to healthcare access and quality? So for the example on the screen, I clicked the blue button. So then now all the states with the answers that are responsive to that first question and also are responsive to this child question in particular are going to be marked with blue in the bottom right corner. So you can see that all those laws then that are marked are going to be responsive to the parent and then the child question. But if you were to scroll down, you could see, and you can't do that here, of course, but if you were to scroll down live on the data set, you could see those other questions that are child questions relating to the other areas of the social determinants of health, education, access, and quality. Does the law relate to neighborhood and built environment, and so on. So you, again, you can click any one or a combination of those buttons because, again, many of these laws relate to multiple areas of the social determinants of health. We can move to the next slide, please. So we wanted to drill down a bit further from those areas of the social determinant of health. So we added some grandchild questions to make just better use of that data. So for this example on the screen, under the question of does a law relate to healthcare access and quality, one of those grandchild questions is, does that law relate to data collection and reporting? If I were to click yes under that question using the color yellow, then you would see that overlapping yellow marker in that bottom left corner. And that indicates, of course, that those laws with all three markers are responsive to the parent question, also relate to healthcare access and quality, and then further to data collection and reporting within healthcare access and quality. And if you could go to the next slide, please. So we want to provide one sort of specific example for you. And for this example, I clicked on the state of Maryland, and to see that that law that I clicked on states that the Maryland Community Health Resources Commission is to receive technical assistance from the Chesapeake Regional Information System for patients who will maintain a data set then and support program evaluation. And for that particular law, it states that the Pathways to Health Equity program is to be established by the commission, and then that program will provide grant funding to reduce health disparities, improve health outcomes, improve access to primary care, promote primary and secondary prevention services, and to reduce healthcare costs and hospital admissions and readmissions. Now, if you could go to the next slide, please. So there are some questions we have that did not relate to the social determinants of health, but we wanted to pick up on some other trends we were seeing. So we added these other questions outside of the social determinants of health. And these are questions that capture things that we thought, well, this could really be expected to have the effect of either advancing or impeding racial health equity. So those questions on the screen, if you can't read them, they are, does a law require implicit bias and or cultural competency / sensitivity training? Does a law create a task force, committee, work group, or other similar entity? Does a law relate to a declaration of racism as a public health crisis? Does the law explicitly prohibit or restrict education or training that addresses health or racial equity? And rather, does a law restrict diversity, equity, and inclusion related actions at educational institutions? For that last question, on the screen, there are some other questions that flow from that same topic of DEI-related actions at educational institutions, again, to drill down a bit further on a trend that's really taking off. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So the network, of course, supported this work to aid other practitioners and community-based organizations by providing data to help support claims that are being made and to also identify trends that we are seeing just a bit more concretely. So we hope that this introduction will help you feel inclined to investigate the data set yourself, discover some of these interesting items that we found. I provided a QR code on the screen. That'll take you to the network's webpage for a bit of background on the data set. And you can scroll down a bit. There's a Explore the Data Here button, and you click that to go directly to Law Atlas. I have my contact information on the screen. If you have questions, if you found an interesting law that we didn't include, or if you need any assistance, please feel free to reach out. And thank you for this time and for your time to introduce you to this data set that we're pretty excited about.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Phyllis, for that overview. Next up, Medina, I'll have you take over.
Terrific. Thank you all so much for the invitation to join you. And thank you all to the attendees who have taken time out of their busy schedules to be here with us today. So as Jane mentioned, I'm Medina Agenor. I am an associate professor in the Department of Behavioral and Social Sciences and Epidemiology at Brown University School of Public Health. And today I'll be talking about the critical importance of centering communities of color in legal epidemiology and beyond. So first, a few definitions, just to make sure that we are all on the same page. So as you know, and we've been talking about this for the last 30 minutes, racism, which is a social, economic, and political system that privileges people racialized as white and harms people racialized as Black, Indigenous, or another person of color, functions on multiple social levels, including the structural, the cultural, the institutional, the interpersonal, and the intrapersonal level. In particular, you'll see here in our 2017 Lancet article, we define structural racism as, quote, the totality of ways in which societies foster racial discrimination through mutually reinforcing systems of housing, education, employment, earnings, benefits, credit, media, healthcare, and criminal justice. These patterns and practices in turn reinforce discriminatory beliefs, values, and the distribution of resources. It's important to note that the key defining feature of structural racism in comparison to other forms of racism is that it relies on and functions across social institutions, which are interconnected and operate with a set of mutually reinforcing racialized rules, regulations, and laws that maintain white supremacy. And it's really those connections among social institutions and their rules, regulations, policies, and laws that make racism structural. And that also allows racism to reinvent itself into new forms that persist across institutions despite civil rights interventions directed at specific institutions. It's also important to note that historically, the law is a colonial creation that has played and continues to play a central role in establishing and perpetuating structural racism in the United States and globally. In fact, some of the first US laws were established to maintain white supremacy in the context of slavery, settler colonialism, and capitalism. There's also myriad contemporary laws that criminalize and harm Black, Indigenous, and other people of color on the books today, and laws that could disproportionately benefit communities of color, dating all the way back to the Reconstruction era to the present, have systematically not been passed, enacted, enforced, or completely repealed. It's also important to note, as Derek Bell and other critical race theory scholars tell us, that piecemeals, oh, sorry, thank you. Next slide, I'm forgetting to say next slide. Thanks, Lindsay. Next slide, and next slide, thank you. Oh, nope, go back one. Thank you. It's also important to know, as Derek Bell and other critical race theory scholars have told us, that legal reforms have not ended structural racism. And so it's important to consider, as we've been discussing for the last 30 minutes, the role of past and present laws in shaping unequal and inequitable distribution of social determinants of health, both within and across racialized groups. And again, critical race theory tells us that we should not only be paying attention to laws that are explicitly related to racism, but also to laws that are implicitly related to and perpetuating structural racism and racism at various levels. In particular, we've chosen to focus on state laws because state laws reflect and shape the specific historical context, the political climate, and the social and cultural norms of particular states with wide variation across the United States. Next slide, please. So just to kind of situate us within a historical context, I want to be clear that there has been rich theoretical and conceptual work on structural racism and state laws, including in relation to health, dating all the way back to the 19th century. So if you're familiar with the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, for example, he has spoken about this at length, as have others in the last 200 years. So what I'm talking about today is nothing new, right? However, what has been lacking specifically in the realm of public health is empirical research on how structural racism, state laws, and racialized health inequities relate to one another. So to date, most of the research that has investigated this area has really focused on the impact of historical Jim Crow laws on mortality and chronic diseases among Black compared to white individuals. And so there's really a need for additional work that examines the impact of contemporary, again, both explicitly and implicitly racist laws on the lives, health, and well-being of Black, Indigenous, Latina, Asian, and other minoritized groups. And so several years ago, a group of multidisciplinary public health, a multidisciplinary group comprised of both public health researchers and also legal scholars with expertise in racism and health and also racism and the law, came together to develop a database of state-level structural racism related state laws in the United States with the goal of really contributing to efforts documenting the nefarious impacts of racist state laws on racialized health inequities. And so we drew on legal epidemiology as well as policy surveillance methods, as others have discussed. And we also use critical race theory as our theoretical framework to develop a typology of 10 legal domains of contemporary US state laws that are both, again, explicitly and also implicitly related to structural racism. Yes, I will talk about that in a second. And so you'll see the 10 legal domains that we included in our database here. So ranging from voting rights to stand your ground to racial profiling, mandatory minimum, prison sentencing, immigration protections, fair housing, minimum wage, predatory lending, school punishment, and stop and identify laws. Again, these were theoretically driven decisions informed by a multidisciplinary research team. And so through this process, we identified a total of 843 state laws on the books related to structural racism. And our study specifically focused on 2010 to 2013, and we included all 50 US states in the District of Columbia. So during that time period, we also found that most states had laws that harmed people of color in these 10 legal domains. And in fact, most states did not have laws that provided protection above and beyond what was already kind of federally provided. And so just to let folks know, this database is currently available directly through me as an Excel file with a data use agreement that I'm happy to share with you all. And we're also now with funding through the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation able to extend our database so to span from 2010 to 2024. And so we're working with folks at Temple, at the center who have been terrific, Lindsay Cloud and her team, to really make sure that we are providing, again, these 843 laws to the present, right, as these issues continue to be and will likely become even more increasingly relevant in the coming years. And we're also going to be adding additional relevant domains, like, for example, healthcare, which we didn't include the first time around. So things like Medicaid expansion and also abortion restrictions. And so to date, we've used this database in a variety of studies. You can find some of our work published in Health Affairs, where we were able to link this database to mortality data among both Black and white individuals. Spoiler alert, these laws are harmful to everyone. So definitely email me if you want that paper. And also, there's lots of, we've shared the database already, lots of researchers and policy advocates who will have linked it to a range of outcomes, including child health, reproductive health, maternal health, and other indicators of health and well-being. So please also stay tuned for their work. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we were able to receive additional funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to support not only the extension of our database, but also its expansion. So we're currently working, again, with folks at Temple to add legal domains and laws related to food justice and sovereignty. And so just so we're kind of all clear and on the same page, food justice is really an approach that places the need for food security, that is access to healthy, affordable, and culturally appropriate foods in the context of structural racism and other racialized structures of oppression and exploitation of people, animal, and the lands, both within and beyond food systems. Additionally, we are taking seriously the issue of food sovereignty, which refers to the collective right of people to enjoy healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through socially just, ecologically sound, and sustainable methods. And so it is really important to note that while we're focusing on state laws related to these issues, food justice and food sovereignty are really social movements that are born out of the resistance of Black, Indigenous, Mexican, and Mexican American, and other activists in relation to forced removal from the land, to systemic barriers to farming resources and opportunities, and to worker exploitation in corporate food systems. And so important to note that, again, this is part of an ongoing struggle for liberation led by communities of color in the context and in the afterlife of slavery, settler colonialism, dating back to those eras and also to the civil rights movements of the 1960s and through the present. And so recognizing this history, it is really important for us who are working in academic settings to think about how are we going to center the lived experiences and the priorities and the concerns of those who are most impacted on the ground. And so we have incorporated a community-centered process to our approach to developing this new food justice and sovereignty legal domain. And so we'll be getting input throughout our project from, again, the communities who are most impacted in relation to growing food, eating food, and sharing food, again, in the context of ongoing structural racism. Next slide, please. And so really what is driving our commitment to engaging communities who, again, are bearing the brunt of these racist laws is this idea and this value that communities are the experts on the conditions of their lives, right? And that those most impacted by structural racism and its various manifestations have the greatest knowledge, both of how it undermines people's health, but also of what we can and should do to remedy this unjust situation. And so really, legal data and really any kind of data that we create as researchers or academics are only as good as the extent to which they support communities on the ground, right? And so our real commitment is to think about how can we contribute to ongoing efforts, right? Ongoing food justice and sovereignty efforts in a way that is meaningful. And the best way to do that is to actually ask people what they need. So again, we'll be engaging in community-centered work during all phases of policy surveillance. We'll have key informant interviews with people with both lived and professional expertise in the area of structural racism and food justice and sovereignty to both develop and refine our legal domains and identify specific relevant laws. We'll also conduct focus groups with community members, organizers, and advocates to obtain feedback on our legal database once we have a prototype created of these domains. We'll also seek their input as we continue to examine the impact of structural racism on health inequities. And just to say, we're not reinventing the wheel here by any means. We're partnering with folks who have been doing this work on the ground for a long time now. Specifically, our community partner here is Vital Village Networks, which is led by Dr. Jarrett, who's a pediatrician and social epidemiologist at BU. And so we can drop the link in the chat too for Vital Village Networks. They're doing incredible work related to food justice, but also reproductive justice and other areas. So really, I'll just close here by reflecting on the fact that given the pernicious, complex nature of structural racism, we are really just tackling one slice of the issue. And if we are serious as a community in terms of tackling structural racism, we will really have to engage in a multi-pronged approach that not only seeks to repeal racist laws and policies, but also gets at the root of some of the other root causes of structural racism, like ideology, norms, governance structures, and also historical legacies. And so, as you might have heard folks talking about the need to really imagine and think beyond the bounds of the law and think beyond the bounds of existing systems, structures, institutions, and practices to really have a renewed commitment to approaches that center autonomy, self-determination, reciprocity, mutuality, and care. And luckily for us, these are principles and values or practices that have been central and continue to be central to Indigenous and Black traditions around the world for centuries. And so we're in really good company in thinking about these issues in the context of legal epidemiology. And next slide. So again, I'd like to close by just acknowledging the folks who are making this work possible and who we are working closely with, especially Dr. Bryn Austin, who's a co-principal investigator on this project. I also want to thank you all for being here today, for listening, and also to turn it over to Leo, who will talk about how issues of food injustice and really the importance of thinking about actively engaging marginalized communities in this work is really central to making positive, lasting change. So Leo, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone, and thank you, Dr. Agenor, for that presentation, and all the presenters. This is truly amazing and inspiring work. Like I said, my name is Leonardo Arriola Carnicelli, and I used to be a student with Dr. Agenor. I was in her qualitative methods class, so she invited me to talk a little bit about how I have implemented community engaged practices in the work that I do. So I'll start with the work that I'm currently doing right now, which is next slide, please. I'm working with the Rhode Island Department of Health for an initiative that they have, which are called the Health Equity Zones. And these are an approach developed by Rhode Island to address social determinants of health and improve the well-being of communities who have been disproportionately affected by systemic injustices and racial discrimination. What the HES is trying to do is to bring residents and local organizations together to build strong and healthy communities and allow residents to drive the changes and improvements that they want to see in their communities. So next slide, please. So I currently work with one of the health equity zones in Rhode Island, and it's called Pawtucket Central Falls Health Equity Zone. And these are two cities in Rhode Island that have the largest migrant population in the state and are disproportionately burdened with high rates of chronic disease, and a majority of its residents have a low income, which are some of the reasons why these cities were designated to have a HES. So the way that we operate this HES is based on a participatory planning process through which we were able to identify 4 main community needs, and them being housing, youth engagement, food and nutrition, substance use, and mental health. So these identified needs became the foundation for work groups composed of residents and local community organizations that have developed action plans to improve these aspects of the community over the course of time. So I'll just give you guys an example of what I had, how I started working with the HES. I began my work with the HES supporting the Food and Nutrition Task Force, which is one of the work groups, and by creating a map of food resources across the cities. And with this map, we conducted a series of focus groups with residents in each city where they helped me revise the food map to make sure it was accurate and conducted a needs assessment at the same time, which both instruments were able to create some initiatives that have been led by the task force. One of the main initiatives that was created through this process was the position of what we call a food ambassador, which is essentially a community health worker that's specialized in supporting community members in accessing resources to support nutrition. And the food ambassador also hosts nutrition classes in community settings and helps residents with navigating SNAP and WIC applications, among many other things. But what's important from highlighting this is that this came as an identified need of not knowing what resources were available in the community. Like this is something that was voiced by the participants from the needs assessment and things like that. And also their desire to have education opportunities available to help families make better healthy eating choices to support their well-being. So this is a little bit about the work that I do with the health equity zones in Rhode Island. And I wanted to share a little bit about a separate project that I'm also working on. So next slide, please. And this started through my thesis work during my MPH at Brown, which is a project that's called Examining Food Security Among Immigrants with an Undocumented Status in Rhode Island. And it's a call for inclusive nutrition assistance programs. I initially came up with this idea for this project out of frustration from volunteering at food pantries, from my lived experience, and also from like listening to community members at these food pantries and listening to them at the needs assessments that were done at Pawtucket Central Falls, where they were talking about like their main concerns are that immigrants with an undocumented status primarily rely on food pantries and that they have relatively no access to other resources. So to like prioritize our work to support these communities, specifically in Pawtucket and Central Falls, would be something to focus on. So I decided to do this in Rhode Island, but most of my participants were recruited from Pawtucket and Central Falls. So next slide, please. Dr. Agenor already gave a really great overview about food security, so I just wanted to add a little component of it, which we focused on food security, meaning like meeting a person's dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. But I like to add the component of personal dignity at all times, which is often not met when we think about the resources that we primarily rely on in the United States for addressing food security, and one of those is the charity system, and by that I mean food pantries. So just because of the interest of time, I'm going to quickly go over this. But like we might be aware, immigrants with undocumented status don't have any safety net resources unless they have minors or are pregnant individuals. And so the definition of food security really isn't met when we're like providing support to these communities as of now, because most of it relies from these charity systems. So next slide, please. So the goal of my study was to really understand these experiences and to also get their perspectives on how we could be better addressing this the situation to better support them, and to also get their perspective on what an idea that I've been thinking about, which is the implementation of a state-funded initiative that would provide nutritional assistance to all low-income individuals, regardless of citizenship, would look like in their opinion, like if this would be something that would be useful to them, if this would be something they would be willing to go for. And also to get their suggestions from like potential leaders in their community who they see advocating for their needs, so that I could interview and also get their insights for like potentially implementing a program like this or other potential alternatives. And which is what I did, because my methodology, like I've said, it was community engaged research practices. And I don't have much time to get into the details of like the results from the study. So next slide. I'll just briefly say that I got multiple and vast like experiences from both my participants and also from the community leaders. They all came to the consensus that yes, immigrants with undocumented status primarily want to have their documentation because that would allow them to participate in a formal economy as opposed to the informal economy that they're participating, which leaves them prone to being abused by their work, by their bosses and things like that, and also like continuously relying on these charity systems to support their well-being. So given that there's no easy path to naturalization, both the community members and legislators and leaders that I was able to interview agreed that advocating for the implementation of a program like this, which would be state funded on nutrition assistance. And I said CFAP there because there's one that's similar in California right now. Yeah, so overall, I just wanted to highlight that both these projects that I just outlined not only seek to serve underserved populations, but because they seek to understand, they seek underserved populations to help develop and really drive the solutions that impact them the most. So yeah, that's what Dr. Agenor was saying of like deep community engagement. But yeah, that's all I had. And if any of you want to learn more about the study or any of the other projects that I mentioned so far, here's my contact information. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Leo. I wanted to go ahead and actually, can you pull the slides back up for a second? Bethany, my apologies. But we have about 7 minutes. So like I said, feel free to go ahead and chat any questions that you might have. If you want to advance to the next slide, perfect. But I just wanted to give a final thought here that it really all comes back to this here, that the structural racism and other intersecting oppressions are the root cause. So I just want to keep this slide up to further digest as we go through the Q&A. And again, feel free to use the chat or the Q&A option on Zoom. One question, I think this is really for Cydney and DeAnna. What are some of the most surprising things that you found in your state constitutions research so far?
Yeah, I can take that for a little bit. I think some of the things that were surprising to me personally was just the amount of explicitly racist things that were still in state constitutions, even though our time period is 2003 to 2023, and some of it was clearly like those provisions are clearly not actually being enforced in any way. They're not enforceable, and yet they're still there. So yeah, that was definitely one thing that was surprising, but also not surprising, I guess I should say.
Right.
But yeah, just like the real explicitness of some of this. Yeah. Cydney, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Like some of the language was very jarring, and to see just still on the books, especially in states that do permit like citizen initiated ballot initiatives, like the thought that no one has moved to change that language yet, or in places that have, it's just very slow moving and distressingly recent. And I think like in terms of like legal variables that hadn't been on my radar until like really getting into the project, like background memos and just initial research, which is how many states officially declare English to be the common language of the state.
Right.
The extent to which that position is like safeguarded in the state constitution is just like very interesting. Yeah, I think those two things are just very shocking in this project so far.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think those are all, I'm sure, probably very jarring as you were kind of building that out. Phyllis, somebody asked, how can folks best use the data set that you presented on? What are your thoughts on that?
I would invite you to go ahead and play with it. There's a really wonderful tutorial that's on Law Atlas. If you'd like a little bit of help navigating it, we tailored the presentation today to help it feel a little bit more inviting to dive into yourself. But look at the area that you work in the most, the area that you're the most interested in, and just play around with it a little bit so it can become familiar, and you will see some of these laws that will strike you, some of these trends that will strike you when you play in, a certain area of a social determinant of health. I would invite you to just go mess around with it without any agenda outside of this is the area I'm interested in or do the most work in. We think you'll find a lot of it is really useful. It covers quite a bit of information.
Wonderful, thank you. And one other question for you. What were some of the challenges that you faced when you were compiling the data set?
There were, I mentioned one of the challenges in having to take out a handful of laws so that we wouldn't be watering down our data and do more of a general health equity data set. But we had a lot of different discussions. We noticed this trend. We saw a lot of what were called task groups, or excuse me, task forces, work groups, committees, and we started tracking those for those one of those questions that's outside of the social determinant of health buckets. But at some point, we realized we needed a really good working definition of what we were putting in that category. Some of these groups we noticed were permanent. And what we thought about, or rather what we agreed on after some discussion, is we wanted to capture those committees, those work groups that were sort of temporary in nature, because it was something we wanted to be able to measure what outcomes they were tasked with, and then where that advice that they provided went from there, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, wonderful. So I think all of the presenters did share their contact information. So if you do have any questions, I'm sure they're fine, again, to reach out to them. If you could advance to the next slide. So I just wanted to remind everyone that we will be holding our next introduction to policy surveillance webinar on Tuesday, December 3rd at 12 p.m. I am going to drop the registration link in the chat for anybody who is interested. And I just wanted to once again thank all of our presenters today. Really, really wonderful information, amazing, incredible work. And I really want to thank everybody who attended today once again, took time to tune in. I hope this information was helpful, and I hope everybody has a great weekend. So thank you so much.